Hello, you are listening to KPMG's Energy Exchange podcast, a podcast where we explore the path to Ireland's exciting energy future. We discuss the practical things that we can do to unlock the full potential of Ireland as a major energy producer. I'm Colm O'Neill, and today I'm joined by Dr. Val Cummins, who is the Chief Impact Officer with Simply Blue, who develop pioneering projects in the blue economy, which I'm sure you'll elaborate on later, Val, and you're very welcome with us today. First of all, maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about Simply Blue, because people may not be familiar with either yourself or the organisation.
Okay. So I'm the Chief Impact Officer for Simply Blue Group, which is all about really delivering on our purpose and our sustainability objectives. I'm a member of the board of the group, so a lot of responsibility that comes with that, taking the sort of 360-degree view of the business. And I also, with a small company, sometimes you wear multiple hats. I work as the project managing director for a joint venture partnership that we have here in Ireland with EDF to develop floating offshore wind, and I hope and trust we'll come back a little bit to that. And all of that happens in the context of an Irish company, headquartered in Cork. Simply Blue Group is a renewable energy project developer, and we are developing projects in onshore wind, offshore wind, sustainable fuels, and also low-impact aquaculture. And we have offices here in Ireland, in the UK, in Spain and in Canada to support a portfolio of projects across all of those areas. So it's a very exciting place to be.
It really is, and quite a breadth of activity the company does, but also you doing a kind of an overarching role as well as a really kind of hands-on operational delivery role as well.
Diversity, it's the spice of life.
It is, and as you say, that's one of the opportunities you get in a smaller company, is that opportunity to kind of do that multitude of things.
It is great because you get to see and hear different aspects of what's happening in a business that has been scaling and growing very quickly over the last few years. Simply Blue was founded in 2011 by Sam Roach Perks and Hugh Kelly, both from Ireland, and they started out pioneering projects in wave energy, which is an area that is still waiting for that wonderful moment of commercialisation and industrialisation and rollout. So around 2018, they pivoted to floating offshore wind and became interested in adapting a project they were developing in the UK into that area, and secured an initial joint venture partnership with Total to build a 100 megawatt test and demonstration floating offshore wind project off Pembroke. And that was the seed then of really a business development strategy that has seen us come into the markets that I described earlier in multiple jurisdictions.
Wow. So quite a story in terms of how you landed. It's not where you started, but it kind of landed you in a...
Exactly. And for me, I didn't start there. I was actually 21 years in University College Cork. Again, with lots of different hats on before I joined Simply Blue, which I did now literally almost 4 years ago to the day. And I came home from the university and told my husband in the middle of COVID that I was leaving my wonderful job in research and academia to join this small Irish company, and this guy called Sam Roach Perks and Hugh Kelly, and he was saying, who are they and what are you doing? And have you lost your mind? But it was a fantastic jump. It was bold at the time, but I must say I haven't looked back. It's been a great journey.
Very good. And I guess that whole energy transition is something that's a motivating thing for lots of people to get involved in. But maybe just to kind of broaden out that view for a second, we've just recently released the Energy Institute's World Statistical Review of Energy, the definitive report on world energy consumption. And yet again this year we consumed more fossil fuels than we did the year before, very much reflected in our own consumption here in Ireland, where despite all the progress that we've made, the vast majority of the energy that we consume here is fossil fuel-based energy. So maybe just that big picture, what's your view of where we are on the energy transition at the moment?
Well, the reality of it is, just looking at Ireland, we are the most fossil fuel dependent economy in all of Europe. And I remember being at a conference last year where Paul Dean, who was a former guest of yours from University College Cork, spoke about the fact that we're spending €1 million every hour importing fossil fuels. So look, that's reflective of the bigger picture and what you've reported for there in terms of the World Energy Outlook. What I've observed is that there's wonderful political momentum towards achieving greater and greater targets for renewables. And we've seen announcements in global platforms, through COP, through Europe with regards to European energy ministers, through to our own energy minister here, talking about 2050, 2040, even 2030. And clear targets, but actually what's lacking is a plan to reach them in reality. And I think the energy transition is vital for our future, for survivability. It's not just about climate change, which is an existential crisis in and of itself, but it's about energy security, and it's also a massive opportunity for future economic growth and to develop indigenous enterprises and opportunities for export. But despite all of that, it's quite extraordinary, isn't it, that the world isn't moving in the right direction and it's not going fast enough. And I think, as an Irish company with an international footprint, looking at the global energy market, for sure, I think it has slowed down even more in the last 12 to 24 months. And the big influencing factor in all of this, it's oil and gas, and it's the prevailing dominance of the fossil fuel sector.
And it is. I think we sometimes do miss that opportunity, and maybe a unique opportunity for us here in Ireland. There are other countries who have to transition to renewable energy. For us here in Ireland, it is absolutely in our best interests to move to renewable energy, because at the moment we import often from not desperately reliable sources in terms of where the source energy sources are for fossil fuels. And so that ability to be independent with our own energy system, and then to potentially capitalise on that even further with building our industrial base or even exporting energy is a massive opportunity for us. And we maybe don't spend enough time talking about that.
Absolutely. I think for sure, as an island nation on the periphery of Europe, we are particularly vulnerable when we rely on importing our energy needs from other countries. And that was manifest when Russia invaded Ukraine, and we saw such huge impact in terms of spikes in the cost of electricity for consumers and for householders. And that is a risk to our economy at the end of the day, which could be mitigated against if we decide to use our abundance of natural resources. And I know when I was in school, we used to think about natural resources in geography in the context of coal and so on, and digging them up. And again, it wasn't something that we had. We had bogs, and that was limited. But we didn't have the kind of natural resources that developed the massive economies of places like Germany. But now, in this modern era, we look at our ocean area, it's 7 times our land mass. We have one of the largest maritime areas to land mass in all of Northwest Europe. And, we have the Wild Atlantic Way, which speaks to the fact that we have a wild Atlantic on our doorstep, which, guess what, has some of the best wind resources in the world. So we're not deprived of natural resources. We have an abundance. And that's our opportunity, is to tap in to offshore wind and to complement that with the developments that are underway in onshore wind and solar and storage as well.
And maybe if we zone in on that for a second, because it's the blue economy, which is a super term, but the ocean is an amazing resource for us. It has been for centuries with fishing and so on and so forth. But now for us here in Ireland, it's clearly a very significant opportunity for us. Where are we, as you see it at the moment, in our ability to capitalise on that resource that we have and really make it work for Irish people?
We're in a sea change where we've woken up to the opportunity, and we've moved away from maybe thinking about Ireland looking inward to think about Ireland looking outward. And what does it take to unlock that ocean potential? Well, it's taken a whole new regulatory framework and a whole new way of thinking. So in Ireland, over the last 5 years, what has been happening here has been characterised by policy change. So the government, in fairness, has been putting in the building blocks for development of our marine resources. And that has required new legislation, capacity building within government departments, new plans and new policies. So on the plus side, we have a marine planning framework now. We have a new licensing and leasing authority, which is MARA. This year alone, we've published a new, and the first time ever, an industrialisation plan for offshore wind. And the government, which is great to see, I think is going to have a huge impact. And the government published its future framework. So all of that is really important for industry to see things are going in the direction of unlocking the potential. But in order for that to really kick in, we need to see a more detailed plan. And that's what Ireland is lacking. For industry to invest, it's, you know, everybody says, but you need certainty. What's going to happen when, so you can plan with your boards how best to manage the investment going forward. So I think Ireland is doing great things, but it's missing a trick in relation to thinking a little bit more about how industry needs can be met to retain investment and to secure more, because at the end of the day, it's a competitive marketplace. And the risk to Ireland is, while it's getting its house in order, other jurisdictions are going to be more attractive for business.
We do seem to have lots of ambition and targets, but not necessarily the ability to execute on those. And that is impacting your ability to raise capital, and capital is starting to move to other more predictable markets.
And I think that is the short-term consequence. The longer-term consequence is back to what we discussed earlier. Where will Ireland be in the future if it doesn't have energy independence? Where will Ireland be if it can't guarantee cheap, clean, green energy to our foreign direct investment clients who are demanding this now? So I think when we think about the future of Ireland, it's absolutely vital that we are moving faster in the right direction with regards to developing our renewable energy sector. I was at an event last Friday, the Ennis Chamber of Commerce, which is a wonderful organisation, hosted its annual President's Lunch, and Taoiseach Micheál Martin spoke. And he spoke probably for 50% of the time on the subject of renewable energy, and very much conscious of the location in County Clare, the impact that Money Point has had on the region. But he made a very strong point where he said that the future of Ireland's economic development is based on two pillars, and the sweet spot is where they come together. And that's renewable energy and artificial intelligence. And he made the point, and I strongly agree with it, that instead of thinking about data centres as something that's black and white, oh, we don't want that, and there isn't, you know, a lot of jobs to be created, and having that conversation on your mobile phone, by the way, maybe through social media, not making the link. Ireland's opportunity in terms of the educated workforce that we have here and the track record that we have is to do so much more in that space. And think about the ecosystem that revolves around having the capacity to attract and retain more of that business in future, which is entirely dependent on cheap, clean renewable energy. And we could do that.
And these are organisations that make decisions in 10, 15, 20-year time horizons. And so, you know, Ireland putting up the "we're closed" sign is not helpful in that regard when we anticipate having all that clean renewable energy available in that time frame.
I think that maybe from the point of view of policymakers, it's a challenge to be brave and bold sometimes. And I completely understand that. You know, you're trying to mitigate against any risks, but sometimes and particularly in a crisis, and we are in a climate and biodiversity crisis, progress is better than perfection. Yeah. And I think the key point that I hear asked is, well, where is all this electricity going to go? Why would we want to go hard and fast in terms of developing, for example, floating offshore wind at scale off the Atlantic? Well, I'll tell you where it will go. It will help us to get to net zero by 2050 or maybe even sooner. Some of it will go onto the grid. We desperately need to reinforce our own domestic grid situation. There's an opportunity to do more by way of interconnections, and the department certainly are recognising that. We need to think about things like interconnected supergrids and how Ireland can influence that scenario and outcome for Europe, which means that Ireland is no longer a peripheral economy, but it's actually central to feeding the core and being robust in and of itself, because we can then attract and retain different types of businesses as a consequence of doing this, as well as the energy export piece.
If you look at that kind of the big barrier to execution that we would hear over and over again with clients is planning. Planning is probably the most significant barrier people would mention. Is that similar for you in the projects that you're working on?
Absolutely. I think we're at an early stage of project development, so we haven't got to the point of submitting planning applications into onboard Planola, but plenty of colleagues have, particularly, for example, with the phase 1 offshore wind projects that are being developed. And there's huge concern amongst industry with regards to the capacity of the planning authority to process the applications, given how comprehensive they are. And really, this is the first time that we will require deep expert knowledge to make judgments about what's happening at sea. But planning, look, it's all about development, and it's all about a mindset and a culture. And so you can't start soon enough to try and introduce the whole concept of the big ticket infrastructure that we're trying to achieve and deliver here. And certainly, while the government is being proactive with regards to looking at our planning legislation and trying to streamline decision-making processes, I think you could ask, has it gone far enough, and are the changes going to be deep enough to make sure that strategic infrastructure that needs to be delivered in and for a crisis can be delivered in a timely way. And I think when you look at Ireland relative to other countries, unfortunately, our planning system here and the culture of judicial review means that as developers, we make assumptions about timelines that are slower than what you might get in the UK or elsewhere. And we really do need to address that issue.
Yeah, and it's interesting because that whole planning system and the projects that get tied up in that planning system source of great frustration. But another piece of research that we did, we published recently, called Powering Tomorrow, looked at what people's attitudes were to those large-scale infrastructure projects, and we were really surprised. Actually, there was really significant support. I think it was well over 70% support for large-scale renewable energy projects, and the question was asked: would you support them in your area? Which that was really pointed. Yes. And we didn't expect to see that kind of support, but that kind of passive support doesn't seem to be turning into advocacy that pushes back against maybe some of those smaller groups who vigorously oppose these projects.
I think that is an issue, and certainly I know I did some research in the university before I finished in UCC, and it certainly adds to the evidence that you've collected in relation to public perception. Okay, so we specifically did a national poll on public perception of offshore wind, visual impact, proximity, etc. And very, very positive results in relation to people feeling not threatened, but willing to accept. But as you say, they're the surveys. The reality is that when projects are being proposed, you will have the activist voice that is often the loudest, have a very considerable impact, and that, even though it might be a smaller percentage, neutralises the passive voice, which is passive because it doesn't bother to put its head up and say, hang on. So I think that we need to call on the citizens of Ireland, we need to call on the young people, we need to help appreciation and understanding of what's at stake here, so that when we have these national debates, we're able to hear all voices, including those that are for it. And maybe if those voices were a bit louder, our governments would listen and hear more and deal with the kinds of deep changes to the planning system, and more meaningful changes that would allow the infrastructure to be expedited.
It would give them maybe confidence to push forward with more, being braver in that regard. Because I do understand, people in the system and in government and so on. It's a very difficult job.
Absolutely.
And if you don't have broad vocal support for a position, it is difficult to push that through.
And what I would say is that, and hats off to DEC, to the department, who have facilitated a very comprehensive public consultation in relation to Ireland's first designated marine area plan off the south coast. And that plan is looking and has identified 4 key areas for offshore wind development. And there was a really rigorous stakeholder consultation process, which is still ongoing. And hopefully will be concluded as soon as possible, because in terms of enablers, and thinking about the sort of the overall planning system from the point of view of offshore, those DMAPs are probably the most critical enablers, and need to be moved forward a little bit faster now that we have the template for the South Coast DMAP nearly complete.
And it's kind of the first one out the gate, and so it's important that goes,
to get it right.
That goes well. So if there was one thing you could change in the system to support your organisation in achieving your ambitions, which clearly helps Ireland achieve its ambitions, what would be the one thing you would change be?
We do need a more effective organisational structure in government. And again, it has been moving in the right direction. There's a lot more integration of marine planning now with the regulatory aspects, for example. But in places like Germany, they have ministries for renewable energy and industry. And I think we need to move towards that type of a structure to recognise and to cater for the opportunity that we discussed earlier, to not just develop an industry to meet our own targets for climate change, but to develop an industry for future generations, which means that we're going to have a secure economy and real excitement in terms of the technologies of the future that we can attract here. And, you have to have hope and you have to believe in human ingenuity. And I do. And I think the future is a very exciting place, potentially. But now is the time to be putting things in place to get to that point.
I heard a great quote on that where someone was asking about our ability to deliver the energy transition, and to use a financial term. The particular commentator was going, I'm long on human creativity and ingenuity, and I'd subscribe to that. I think we will work it out.
Likewise. But let's not make the problem bigger than it needs to be. Because the longer we take, the clock is ticking, the harder it's going to be to crack that nut. We've already lost too much precious time. So again, we really need to be treating this as a crisis, like we did with the pandemic. And we need all hands on deck, but the right organisational structures would help. Yes.
And if you use that as a kind of a metaphor or a comparison, the pandemic, we organise things specifically for that task.
That's
and we
right.
cut through all sorts of department structures and so on to do that. And that's I guess what you're saying is, organising around the specific task, because it's so big and so important that it might be worth considering.
Cut through it all. See now how efficiently and effectively we can carry on with DMAPs. Let's see how we can actually design and create a planning system that works for strategic infrastructure. Let's have a national campaign to make sure that people are on board
Yeah.
with the changes that are coming as part of this transition and as part of our response to the climate fight.
Brilliant. And I'm maybe going to shift gears a little bit because one of the focuses for this particular podcast series of Energy Exchanges, this is our second version of it, but it is women in energy.
Very good.
And so I'll maybe start by asking you to just give us your career, because it sounds like a fascinating career from academia into business, but how you got into the energy industry.
Okay, I think it started with the Marine, actually. So the Marine story has been the consistent piece.
Periwinkles, I believe.
Oh, stop. I can't get away from them.
You're regretting that.
You found that article, Periwinkle Queen. So yes, periwinkles were part of my formation insofar as I did a master's in ecology, which followed a undergraduate degree in marine geography in Cardiff University. And the study I did for my master's was looking at the distribution and abundance of the edible periwinkle, Littorina littorea.
There you go.
And
I
it was
didn't realise that particular thesis would come back to haunt you for the rest of your career.
Absolutely. But I am an expert on periwinkles. Yeah. So look, that was all about marine resource management. Yeah. And it was about looking at the sea, looking at our resources and seeing how we can develop them in a more sustainable way. So that was just one example. I went on to work in research in University College Cork. I did my PhD through the course of my time in the Coastal and Marine Resources Centre, which is a fabulous research group in UCC. We were based on campus, and then through philanthropic funding from a guy called Lewis Luxman, we relocated onto the naval base in Haulbowline as a small civilian group and had amazing support from the Navy and the adjacent Maritime College. So then we had this wonderful idea about really the synergy that could be achieved for a marine and innovation hub if you could utilise the expertise of the researchers, the knowledge of the Navy and the mariners that were training in the Maritime College. So I was seconded out for a while to run IMERC, which was the Irish Maritime and Energy Resource Cluster. Yeah. We developed the Beaufort building, which now houses the Lear National Ocean Energy Test Tank facility, and we had an amazing period of time where companies were coming to test technology with the Navy, with the researchers, and so on, and that was all about innovation, right? And sort of developing an ecosystem of innovation. And I went on to run a project for Science Foundation Ireland with the specific objective of developing a blueprint for offshore wind. Prior to that, I had been involved in raising research grant income to develop infrastructures for marine renewables. Yeah. It was back in the time of tide and wave being the next big thing. But wind jumped it. Yeah. And that's when I really started to become very excited about the opportunity for Ireland. And when I finished that project, I exited into business.
It's amazing, isn't it? Like you described the journey of Simply Blue to where they are today as kind of a series of kind of pivots and changes as the environment changes. And your career has been very similar to that. It's been you've kind of through creativity and innovation found yourself doing different things as you've gone.
I've been very lucky. Because I've always worked in spaces that I've been really passionate and very interested in. Yeah. And I think that's the thing, isn't it? To find those opportunities, be very motivating.
And so there are many women in the energy industry, but still, when you go to conferences and you look out across the room, it's a largely male audience. So it would seem to still employ mainly men. What do we need to do? What do you think we need to do to kind of increase that balance or improve the balance of men and women in the industry?
Well, certainly, first of all, I think your point about there are amazing women in the energy industry. There's no doubt about it. And I do think there's a lot of space for a lot more. So I think we need to take very proactive measures. Because it just brings a diversity, and we all know the benefit of and the importance of that. So look, I think that being very conscious, if you think about conferences, being very targeted, back to our targets, being target orientated, just saying it's not good enough to have a panel of 3 men and 1.
Yeah.
You know, it's just absolutely not, and nobody should tolerate that if you're paying to attend a conference.
Yeah.
And it should become a norm quite quickly that we have balance. And you see, the reason we don't is because often women aren't in the senior positions.
Yeah.
And the conference seeks to have the most senior person represented. Make space for people to grow into that. And for women to be able to grow into that. Mentorship and networking are the 2 things that I think are vitally important. I think we all have a responsibility to mentor when we've been lucky enough to have careers that have got us to a place where we're very happy. And I think it's important to give back and to give guidance and support and to really encourage anybody who's starting any career, irrespective of the sector or the discipline. Probably the single most important thing you need to do is develop your network and just to encourage that understanding and to give people the confidence to go out and do that, because it's not always easy walking into a room full of strangers and finding your space. But that's the area that people need to go into.
And it's really interesting that you kind of talk about that whole mentorship, networking, and also role modeling. I think, you know, if you can't see it, you can't be it. That
right.
Role modeling is so important, isn't it? So using those platforms to demonstrate that there are people, there are women working in the industry, and they have a voice, and they have a meaningful contribution to make to the debate.
Absolutely.
And so, you know, there'll be young women out there today. They'll be making subject choices in school. They'll be thinking about what they might pick for their CAO next year. They'll be, you know, wondering what job they might apply for. So if you could speak to those young girls making those decisions, what would be your kind of pitch for why they should consider the energy industry as one where they should consider pursuing a career?
I think young people are really motivated by the planet. I think they understand the climate and the biodiversity crisis. And I think that to have a fulfilling career, it's all about feeling that you have a purpose. So I would encourage anybody to get into these areas, and energy is such a hugely potentially impacting part of this whole transition. So what I would say is think about that as what a wonderfully motivating thing to have as a backdrop to any career in engineering, in law, in project management, in science and communications. It's so broad in terms of the skills that are needed to support this sector. I think people often think of big infrastructure and they think engineers and think engineering. And I would encourage every girl and every parent advising their daughter, think about the STEM opportunities and do think about engineering, but not everybody is designed that way. Right. So do understand that, my goodness, for a project to be conceptualized and delivered, you know, if it's 60 turbines offshore, you need every kind of skill that you can imagine. Yeah. And so if you're going into law, think of maritime law. If you're going into communication, think about specialising. Yeah. And I think that, don't underestimate the breadth of areas that you can get into, and don't underestimate our human ingenuity and our ambition here in Ireland to actually get this job done, because it will happen. I've expressed some of the frustrations in relation to the pace of change, but it is happening and it will speed up. And my God, it'll be a wonderful place to work.
Well, you know what, Val, there's no better place to leave this than on that positive note. So I'd like to thank you for being with us here today. You've been joining us on KPMG's Energy Exchange podcast, where we discuss the practical things that we can do to unlock the full potential of Ireland's energy future. Thank you.